Let's get a working definition of the phrase penal substitution. Whether you're writing this down or listening intently with the purpose of getting a better understanding of this, at least do this. Don't let the moment that God has ordained for you today to not increase your knowledge of the work of the gospel, because that's essentially what we're talking about. Propitiation, penal substitution is this in a textbook manner, and I'll give it to you word for word, verbatim, and then let's give a good working understanding of what this might look like in the real world. And again, the important that you use the term or the phrase penal substitution in a discourse or a sharing of the gospel technically is not necessary. But what the definition is, I argue, is eternally necessary. That we communicate what penal substitution is. Jesus suffered, this is what penal substitution technically means. Jesus suffered the penalty for mankind's sins. Now, I would argue that most Christians would say, well, of course that's what that means. And of course that has to happen. But let's get a deeper understanding of this. Jesus indeed did suffer the penalty for mankind's sins. Look again over to Isaiah 53, verses 4, 5, and 6. And technically we could use the whole servant song to make points to this point. But as we're looking at verses 4, 5, and 6, let's at least carry this with us with a deeper understanding of penal substitution. Verse 4, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. In verse 5, for he was pierced through for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. Jesus suffered the penalty for mankind's sins. It is essentially this: there is divine forgiveness, which can only be satisfied with divine justice. So when we talk about penal substitution, we need to understand that there is something divine happening. There is something heavenly happening. There is something completely other than you and I happening. Jesus suffered the penalty for mankind's sins. Thus, it is a divine forgiveness that is satisfying, or is doing the satisfying work of divine justice. In other words, God is not willing to simply forgive sins without first requiring a satisfaction for the sins. That is justice. It is not justice for you to go to court and you listen case after case after case for a judge to dismiss this and dismiss that. Dismiss guilty individuals and dismiss another guilty person. Dismiss this guilty act and dismiss that guilty act. That's not justice. Injustice is being done to everyone in which the injustice was done to. It is not justice, and so thus it is not penal substitution. It is actually an unrighteous judge behaving unjustly. But a just God, a just judge, a righteous judge, he not only declares the act guilty, but then he takes the just payment that that individual deserves and he satisfies it in a satisfied manner. Penal substitution. The guilt must be removed from the one. The one is found guilty. There's no mistaking. Everyone in the courthouse knows the individual, even the one who's found guilty, knows he's guilty. What will the judge do? Will he dismiss it and say, well, it's okay that you've murdered 10 people this week. You didn't mean to. You promise you'll never do it again? Okay, you should go ahead and go. No, the community would be in an outrage of that because injustice has been served. Penal substitution says, this is guilty, you are guilty, you deserve the payment. The glorious thing here is that Jesus suffered the penalty. He didn't just sweep it under the rug. He didn't just say, let's call it good for the day and let's try again tomorrow. He's satisfied. That's what penal substitution is, which actually matches the whole of Scripture. Scripture tells us that God is slow to anger, that He's abounding in love. There is no more loving act of God upon all of humanity than He would behave slow in His anger, and that He would abound in His love. That He would be just, and He would not be unjust in His action. It's penal substitution. Again, is it important that you go out and impress people with your fancy words? No. But is it necessary that you and I understand what penal substitution is? I argue absolutely. It's eternally important. If we don't get this, what gospel are we telling people? It won't make sense to anyone that Jesus will need to die on a cross, because what's the point if they do not understand the weightiness of the sin that has been committed against the righteous God? And that righteous judge, that righteous God Himself, He must act justly. So to do so, He must pour out His wrath upon the guilt.